Hello everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at solving quadratic equations using square roots. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is solving problems that kind of look like, in the end, x squared is equal to 4. This would be a good example. This would be a very basic example, and the way I would solve this is by taking the square root on both sides and by saying there's a plus or minus here. So this would end up becoming x equals, because the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 4 is 2, x equals plus or minus 2. So why did I write this 2 here? Well, let's take a look at what happens when I square 2. When I square 2, I get 2 times 2, which is 4. And when I square negative 2, I get negative 2 times negative 2, which also equals 4. So when I am applying a square root to both sides, I have to make sure to write plus or minus. Technically, I could write plus or minus on both sides, but that ends up being superfluous. So I only need to write it here, and it makes sense to do it on the term that's not a variable. So before we begin, we know that if we have a parabola, which is going to be a function such as y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, or it could be in one of the other two forms we've learned, then we know it's going to make a parabolic shape. Now this parabolic shape could pass through the x-axis 0 times, 1 time, or 2 times. And so this line here is represented by y equals 0, this x-axis here. So if I say that my parabola ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, then I'm talking about when it crosses through this x-axis, when it intersects. So visually, we know that when we're solving quadratic equations, in any method, including using square roots, we're going to end up with 0, 1, or 2 solutions. So we have to be careful to make sure we include all our solutions. And that is the reason why when I was solving x squared equals 4, and I took the square root on both sides, I had to make sure to write a plus or minus so that I would get x is equal to plus or minus 2, which means that x equals 2 or x equals negative 2 are my two solutions for that problem. Now let's take a look at 3 examples. Let's take a look at 3x squared minus 27 equals 0. Now this one is a little bit more complicated than the one I began with. My ultimate goal here is to get one side of my equation with something squared, and then another side that doesn't have a square in it. So if I look at this equation here, if I'm looking at it, I see that this side right here has a term that's squared, but it also has a term that's not squared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 27 to both sides. This keeps the balance of the equation the same because it's like I'm adding 27 weight to both sides in a sense, if you think of it like a hanger. I've added 27 to both sides, so that doesn't actually change the balance of the equation at all. So this is going to equal 27. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 3, which is 1/3, to get x squared alone, to give me x squared is equal to 9. Okay, great. Now I have one thing squared, one term squared, equals a term that was not squared. This one was not quite the same because 3 itself is not squared, so it's not quite where I want it to be if I want just a thing squared is equal to another thing. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the square root on both sides, and I'm going to take the square root of 9, and I'm going to make sure to say that it's plus or minus because I want to make sure I include all the solutions. Okay, so the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 9 is 3, but then I have plus or minus, so it is plus or minus 3, and that's my answer. If I wanted to be more precise, I could write x equals 3 or x equals negative 3, and that would also work, but I will understand that this is what you mean if you write x equals plus or minus 3. So in this case, we had 2 solutions. Alright, now let's take a look at x squared minus 10 equals negative 10. What I'm going to do here is I want to get this x squared by itself because it is the term that is being squared. So I'm going to add 10 to both sides. X squared, so negative 10 plus 10 is 0. Negative 10 plus 10 is 0. So now I'm going to take the square root on both sides and add plus or minus. And we get x equals plus or minus, well, the square root of 0 is 0 because 0 squared is equal to 0. So now we know that positive 0 is equal to negative 0. So these are in fact the same thing. So x is equal to 0, and we have one solution. Now ask yourself, are there any other numbers that when you take the square root, you only get one solution? Well, I don't think so, because any other number, if we have a number that's positive and I put it in here, then there could be a positive version or a negative version of it. So 0 is special because that we only get one solution, and graphically it makes sense because if I drew a parabola, that would correspond to it touching the x-axis one time. Because that's when it equals 0. Now let's take a look at negative 5x squared plus 11 equals 16. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 11 from both sides to get negative 5x squared is equal to 5. Now I want to get x squared by itself, which is the term that is squared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 1/5, which is the reciprocal of negative 5, which will give me x squared is equal to negative 1. And I want to make sure that the term that's squared is positive. So now I'm going to take the square root on both sides, and this is of course plus or minus. So x is the square root of plus or minus negative 1. Now we seem to have a little bit of a problem here, because a negative number, let's use negative 9 for example, is negative 3 times 3. So any negative number is a positive number multiplied to a negative number. So by definition, there is no real number that when you square it, you'll get a negative. So this has no solutions. Technically, there are complex solutions to this, which you will learn about in a later math class. But for now, we're going to say no solutions, and graphically, this would look like a parabola which does not touch the x-axis and thus has no solutions. Finally, let's take a look at one more variation. So here we see that we have a term, x minus 1 squared equals 25. So now there's a number being subtracted from the x with the whole thing being squared. Well, if you remember to what our goal was, is we just wanted something squared is equal to another thing. We didn't care if it was a plus b squared is equal to c. It doesn't matter what's inside here as long as we have a single thing being squared and the other side of the equation has something that's not being squared. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the square root on both sides. And remember to write plus or minus on this one. So then I'm going to get the square root of x minus 1 squared is x minus 1. And this is equal to plus or minus the square root of 25. So now what I'm going to do here is, because this didn't give me an exact number right off the bat, first let's simplify it one more step. X minus 1 is equal to the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5. But now we don't just say x equals something, we have x minus 1 equals something. So we're going to branch off into two solutions, kind of like we have parallel universes, but of course that's not actually what's going to happen. So then we have x minus 1 equals 5, and the other branch is x minus 1 equals negative 5. These are our two scenarios where we have one equaling positive 5 and the other equal negative 5. To solve this one, we just need to add 1 to both sides to get x equals 6. And to solve this one, we have to add 1 to both sides to get x equals negative 4. So these would be my two solutions. Thank you all for watching.